Hello, my friends. Thank you for joining me again for this week's episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about authenticity. This is a word that gets bandied about often, and I'm often left wondering what it means. And so, over the years, I've developed a little set of tools, what we know as the dimensions of thought, by which to understand where other people are coming from when they say, hey, I'm just being authentic, or they're saying you should be authentic, or they're saying I should be authentic. So here's 4 ways of thinking about authenticity, what it means, and the advantages and disadvantages of every perspective on this episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. So let's start off by talking about a big fancy $10 word called ontology. Ontology are our assertions, our ideas about what is fundamentally real, what is fundamentally actual. And when we're talking about authenticity, there are two camps that seem to be debating back and forth, whether or not they know they are, that have certain assumptions where they're not really asserting up front about what they assume is fundamentally real. They're not stating up front what their ontologies are. Instead, they are coming from an assumed ontology, and it's one that can be coherent or incoherent with other ontologies, harmonious or even contradictory with other ontologies. And therefore, I find that people are misunderstanding one another quite frequently. So let's talk about two categories of ontologies when it comes to authenticity. So some people I've noticed when they're talking about authenticity, what it is and what it means, what they are asserting is a disengaged ontology, meaning that their thoughts, feelings, behaviors is coming from an internal place that is detached from other people, right? There's no fundamental belief that people are in any way interconnected. Instead, they tend to take up our thoughts, feelings, behaviors as internal to us and in no way connected to other people or our shared world around us. So because their ontology is disengaged, because they assume that they are self-contained, that all of their thoughts, feelings, morals, obligations, etc., exist within them, that the ethic is one of self-expression. Like there's this truth inside of them, their thoughts, their feelings, and that they need to express that into the world. And it's like that's where we see some of the moral force when it comes to authenticity, is you need to be authentic, which means you need to come from this internal place and express it out into the world. So there's that ethic of I must speak, and therefore I am morally obligated to do so, and my feelings are whatever I am. And so therefore my identity, my thoughts, my feelings are all the same thing and come from the same place. Now, strangely, there's another way of looking at a disengaged ontology, and that is I've seen other people silence their own voices because they believe in a moral obligation to a disengaged other. So therefore, they are self-contained monads, and the other person's a self-contained monad. And therefore, they're very careful not to speak in a way that would harm or offend or in any way challenge the other person. And so they keep themselves silent. Okay? Like in the first case, where somebody believes that they must speak from an internal frame of reference, I see that a fair bit when I'm talking to people in various settings where somebody will come in and say, well, look, this is just my opinion and I must speak my opinion. And this is just my opinion, as though other people in the room may not share to a degree that same opinion or may not share an experience around that opinion that makes it relatable. And then likewise, I've seen other people, like they'll start an email, I'm so sorry for emailing you, or I'll have an open hour, an open hour clinically or an open hour educationally, and people will stop by and they'll be like, I am so sorry for taking your time. And I'm like, no, that's what? That's what I'm here for. Come, hang out, let's talk, right? So in both cases, there's this radical sense of a disengagement between self and other, between I and thou, that there is this nearly ungulfable bridge, unbridgeable gulf, thank you, an unbridgeable gulf that really creates some tension and some problems when people are trying to relate to one another authentically. And so authenticity becomes an individual personal endeavor spoken out into the world, or it's one where because others are external to you, you keep all of your thoughts, feelings to yourself, because if you put them out into the world, that might in some way offend or hurt somebody else. So, in both cases, it leaves us wondering, what about authenticity from an engaged ontology? Where in an engaged ontology, thoughts, feelings, behaviors approximately match a context within which we are situated. So, in a disengaged ontology, if I am coming to a professor's office hour, for example, I may believe or may assume rather, that the professor is a self-contained monad with his or her own thoughts, feelings, attitudes, opinions, etc., and that mine are just intrusive on that. Or I may come in entitled to say, hey, professor, you need to hear and conform to my point of view, right? Both are inauthentic to that particular context. And so within this context, a professor or a friend or whatever may have open time set aside within which to engage in discourse. And so therefore, rather than saying, here is my opinion and you have to deal with it, which comes from a disengaged place, or assuming that you already have an opinion and therefore me coming in is somehow distracting you from your own agenda and therefore I feel apologetic or less than, that's also disengaged. So in an engaged ontology, we come into that situation, we come into that, having coffee with a friend or coming to an office hour, that it is within that context, like that time is set aside for this case and for this purpose. So the ethic here is different. It's not a moral obligation to the self. And it's not just a moral obligation to the other, like in a disengaged ontology. Instead, it is a moral obligation to the relationship and to the context. And I don't see that as often in our individualistic society when people are talking about authenticity and what it means. So if I am coming to somebody's open office hour, I'm going to express myself in the context of that office hour. So if we have thoughts and feelings and opinions, they make sense within that particular context, right? If I come in and say, here is my thoughts, feelings, and opinions, you have to cope or compensate for some way for me because I'm just being authentic. Or I'm so sorry for distracting you from your own internal agenda. That's not really authentic to that context. Likewise, when we're hanging out with friends, that this is a situation to hang out and to be with friends. So there are some things we bring up and we talk about that friends bring up and talk about. And there are some things we don't, depending on the context. An intimate conversation with a small group of people around very sensitive topics like religion and politics can be very authentic, right? But in a big group of friends, when somebody stands up and makes a very bold religious or political claim, that may or may not be authentic to the activity they're engaged in at the time. So as I'm thinking about the 4 dimensions of thought, and please refer back to our video on the dimensions of thinking, I'm mindful that there are all of these different ways we can take up authenticity and what it means. So one of the things that I'm heavily assuming here, not only am I assuming that the engaged and disengaged ontologies, and that I'm trying to shine a light on those assumptions, I'm also assuming that we have some degree of agency as human beings. I don't know that I believe in free will, and I don't know that I believe in determinism either. So free will, if you'll remember, is this belief that there's this place inside of us that is an uncaused causer. It's the undetermined determiner. That there's this place within our psyche or within our soul that can make choices and affect the world. That it is not in any way constrained or caused by factors out in the environment and out in a relationship. That instead it is something that already exists within us. So ultimately, everything we say, do, and feel is somehow chosen. That's an assumption of free will. And there's a fair bit of evidence for and against free will, depending on what you count as evidence. Likewise, it's very common amongst my colleagues in psychology to assume, if not believe, in a determinism, this idea that there are biological forces as well as the forces of change over time, what we call nature and nurture, that cause us to think, feel, and behave the way we do, and that we really don't have any choice in it. And if there are any choices, they are illusory, or what we call epiphenomenal. Epiphenomenal is a big $10 word that means epi means apart from, and phenomena means the experience. That we may be experiencing having made a choice. We may experience that we have free will, but the determinists argue that those feelings are epiphenomenal to the underlying hard reality, that our behavior is just caused by nature and nurture. So we may think we have free will, we may think we have a choice, but they argue that we really don't. So I'm not sure I'm down with determinism either, because if human beings were determined, then they'd be pretty easy to predict. And as a group, social scientists are pretty good at predicting how human beings will behave. Pretty good, not nowhere near 100%. But individually, people are remarkably hard to predict, especially when they're aware that they're being observed and predicted. So with all of these, I'm assuming that they're engaged and disengaged ontologies that underlie each of these four dimensions, and that regardless of the dimension, that there is human choice in some capacity operating. So hopefully we'll do a video here at someday on, got my producer here, on agencies, talking about the various types of choices and human capacity for choice. So we'll add that to the long list of videos. We've got so many video ideas. So first dimension. So I'm just going to run really quick through, again, refer back to the Dimensions of Thought video. So I'm going to run through those quickly, and then we're going to apply those to authenticity directly. Okay, so the first dimension is categorical thinking. That is, a thing is what it is based on the categories that it meets. So, for example, my eyeglasses are eyeglasses because of our cultural definitions of eyeglasses, right? If there were different kinds of categories, then it would be a different sort of thing, okay? The second dimension is that anytime we have a category of a thing, insofar as it can have an opposite, by defining the thing itself, we're simultaneously defining its opposite, okay? So this is either or thinking. That if I have a certain notion of moral good and I define moral good, and if I'm thinking about it second dimensionally, then moral evil is what is opposite of moral good. And we see this second dimensional thinking all over the place, right? Religion, politics, sexuality, morality, right? That certain people tend to think about these phenomena in very second dimensional ways, okay? That also, because there's this good and bad either or, it's often hierarchical. That there are goods and bads, and goods, of course, are better than goods, and the bads are worse than the goods. And so that's second dimensional. Third dimensional is this notion that, wait, who came up with the categories for the first and second dimensions? Somebody made them up. Are those categories universal? No, they're not. Different languages, cultures, times, we've categorized things differently in different ways that changes what's first and second dimensionally available. Like, I was out to dinner with two of my older sisters and my sweetheart on this last Friday. We went out and got Nepali, a lovely Nepali restaurant up in Salt Lake City. And as we're coming back, my sisters were teasing me about being a little bit of an extrovert. Well, actually, we were all joking together about it. And I tend to make friends where I go. I tend to have or express myself loudly or very presently. And extroversion is now seen as a good thing in our society, for example, whereas extrovert was actually boorish and obnoxious 100 years ago in the English language. And so what extroversion is, the category of being an extrovert, somebody who derives energy from social relationships, somebody who tends to put themselves out there a little bit, that used to be categorized as a good thing, and now it's categorized as used to be categorized as a bad thing, and now it's categorized as a good thing, right? So somebody made up these categories. Personality types, right? What an object is. And all of these are what are called socially constructed. They're all relative. And so as we look across time, place, cultures, languages, things change. And so social construction is the acknowledgement that while a lot of our understanding is languaged within a particular situation, and it's all ultimately relative. Now, the fourth dimension is what we call contextual reasoning, right? Contextualism. Contextualism is this notion that things are what they are in context with other things simultaneously. And so my eyeglasses, for example, are eyeglasses when I'm looking out and seeing you all. They are lenses, for example, when I am just trying to use them to focus a frame, but I can also use them as a magnifying glass to start a fire in a survival situation. right? So depending on the context, things are what they are in context. And some things about context change, sometimes quickly, and some things about context change very slowly. It is the context of the thing, the process itself, that informs whether or not that category is accurate or whether or not it's a problem and to what degree it's socially constructed. For example, taking up the example of extroversion, right? Extroversion and introversion again, that there are contexts within which being very loud and assertive and very socially present might actually chafe other people, right? And there are times where you can be, if you identify as an extrovert, you may be in a situation where you find the social situation depleting when social situations are usually energizing for extroverts. Likewise, for those of you that experience yourself as an introvert, think of those people around whom you are comfortable and whose company is nourishing. That in that context, that's somewhat extroverted characteristics when you're being energized by other people. The alone together phenomenon is something we talk about in healthy relationships, where just hanging out with somebody you like, they're watching anime on their laptop and you're sitting next to them on the couch playing a little handheld video game. That is a nourishing moment, right? That is a closeness that two of you have. But if it's a stranger sitting on that same couch and you change the context, then it stops being nourishing or energizing. That what things are is largely within context. And therefore, it's not just relative and random in language, that there are consistencies across and within context, but not absolutes. So let's review this and let's think about self and other across those four dimensions. Okay, starting with the first dimension. What we find when we're wondering about the question of authenticity is that there are some people that categorize themselves. I am this, I am that. And therefore, whoever they are, they have been given a category that they then try to embody, or they have constructed a category that they try to embody, or both. So, for example, psychologists are very famous for labeling people according to personality types. Some of you may be familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Hey, are you an ENFP, an ISTJ, right? Where do you fall on this particular personality test, and the MMPI, for example, or what is your number code or your color code, right? The other day, some colleagues and friends of mine were joking about which Hogwarts house would you be a member of based on your personality, okay? So the other way we see this is some people self-pathologize. I'm ADHD, I'm OCD, right? That they take the DSM diagnostic categories of various forms of mental health and they label them according to that category, that they are not somebody who happens to meet criteria for these according to the way the DSM is constructed, but instead it becomes their identity. I am this and I am that. So the advantages of applying categorical reasoning to ourselves is self-knowledge and exploration of new possibilities. For example, a friend of mine was just talking to me the other day about how important it is that the people around her have some self-knowledge, and that can happen through self-assessment, particularly around, say, attachment, right? Avoidant attachment, secure attachment, insecure, anxious, ambivalent, okay? And that when people can get in touch with and really self-assess what their attachment style is, that can inform how it is that they relate to other people at home and at work. And so that kind of self-knowledge, people go, oh, this is why I tend to behave the way I do. And this is why people tend to react the way they do. So self-knowledge can be important. And through self-knowledge, you can then obtain new categories. For example, when it comes to attachment, there are colleagues and friends of mine who believe that you can go from an insecure attachment style, of which there are several, to a secure attachment style, which really there's only one. And so that movement from these various insecure, anxious, ambivalent, right, attachment styles into a, like a healthy, secure attachment style, it's moving from one category to another category, okay? And so through self-knowledge, you can explore new possibilities to obtain a new category for being. The disadvantage is self-limitation, foreclosure of possibilities, that this is also likely, just like some people can use a categorical understanding of self to try to obtain a new category, other people are foreclosed within the categories within which they find themselves. For example, I have a very strong opinion, and it's not always a popular opinion, that ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can be a superpower. For example, Diane, the producer director, is sitting just off camera here. I presume by her preference. Ish. she says. Okay. So Diamylin is here because I have a very short attention span. I tend to be a little bit disorganized and I tend to be somewhat absent-minded. For example, she goes through and edits out some of my long pauses, unnecessarily lengthy digressions, etc. And so therefore my creative dynamism that my short attention span grants me would be crippling if she weren't here. Okay? Likewise, okay, I'm going to tell you all a dirty secret. I never registered for college. Now, I'm not saying I don't have degrees in the wall that I earned. Oh, I earned them. But my wife always registered me for college because she knew I would forget. And she wasn't wrong. So once the registration part was handled by her, then that activated me to go to class and to learn lots of information very quickly, and then to be able to, write well and engage with my professors and all of the things that I'm good at. But the detail-oriented things like, hey, Matt, your dissertation's due at this time. I'm like, oh, it is? Well, I knew there was a dissertation, but it's due. Okay. And then, Matt, you need to follow these format guidelines. I do, because I just started writing my dissertation, assuming I knew what I was doing, and it turns out I really didn't. And therefore, I had to reformat my dissertation more than once. So this is years ago, right? Likewise, today, for example, I've got a colleague in my clinical practice, Lindsay, and she's very good at helping me schedule out things in my clinical practice. Diamylin helps me here with parameta perspectives in terms of meetings and presentations in this video series. My wife is very good helping me organize things around the house. My colleagues in the department at the university some of them are very good with agendas and bulleted lists and things like that I wouldn't even think to do, right? And yet once those basic detail-oriented structural things are done, then I can come in with a lot of passion and energy and creativity that sometimes these other people lack. So ADHD, for example, can be a superpower in relation to other people, okay? Insofar as my deficits complement their strengths and vice versa. So the disadvantage that I see amongst other people is that they take up whatever category they have as a limitation rather than exploring possibilities. So yes, I appreciate that self-assessment and self-knowledge can help us innovate and create possibilities for being. I also appreciate that there's nothing inherent in first dimensional thinking that informs that we can or even should do that. The other thing that you'll notice in both cases is that it's moving from category to category, from disabled to superhero, like my position on ADHD, that it's still moving from category to category. So likewise, we see this phenomenon when it comes to categorizing others in the first dimension of thought. So we do this with other people if we're thinking or expressing ourselves first dimensionally. You are this, you are that. So it's interesting the way in which we tend to, as human beings, categorize other people quite quickly. Our stereotyping, our biases, is all our first dimensional assumptions in our relation to other people. We tend to stereotype people in terms of gender, race, politics, religion, and we tend to try to fit people within our assumptive boxes. And what that can create is tension if somebody else does not cleanly fit into one of our boxes. Like a friend of mine, for example, whose parents were not born in this country. She was born and raised in this country. And she has a Southern accent. And so people will ask her, well, where are you from? And she'll be like, I'm from Tennessee. And they'll say, no, where are you really from? And she's like, I'm really from Tennessee, right? And so what they have is because her skin tone and face shape, etc., is not stereotypically from somebody from Tennessee, transcends that stereotype, then therefore people get confused. They're like, okay, you're not fitting my first dimensional box for you. You're not fitting my category. So therefore, say something so I can find a category for you. So there are actual advantages to having biases and stereotypes. They're shorthand for new encounters. If we needed to find out all of somebody's everything before we even attempted to have a conversation with them, just talking to a stranger on a bus, we'd never get to the conversation. We'd be sitting down and saying, okay, what is your genealogy, history, family situation, your genotype, your medical history, your preferred or actual identities, etc. Like it could be very inhibiting and very challenging. The disadvantage, stereotypes and biases create discomfort when others do not conform to these biases, and can also create contention, like even relational struggles, if not bigotry and discrimination, if not violence, right? So the least it can create is distance and misunderstanding. But sometimes it creates really problematic things. This last semester has been pretty heartbreaking because there have been moves and initiatives to defund and limit diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has included certain exclusions around gender and gender identity. And so therefore I've had several transgender students this semester really in a crisis because of where the classrooms are located is quite a ways from, sometimes even a floor separate from, the all gender bathrooms. And the all gender bathrooms are also the busiest bathrooms on campus because they are all gender. So male, female, trans, non-binary, gender fluid, etc., all that those bathrooms are available to everybody, and they're one room, little bathrooms, one person at a time. And so sitting down with these students, I had to say, okay, anytime you need to leave class because you need to go wait in line for one of the all gender bathrooms, please do that. And all of this drama and all of this heartache because people have certain biases around gender and certain stereotypes around gender and certain stereotypes around trans dynamics. And they have written legislation and passed legislation around their stereotypes and biases in a way that is harmful to people whose actual identities and actual experiences do not conform to the biases of those writing the legislation. So the second dimension of self and others. So there's a polarizing of self and a polarizing of others. And so stereotyping bias, insofar as we believe that our stereotypes and our biases are the right, true, and correct ones, then we've slid from the first dimension of thinking well into the second dimension of thinking. So I see self-polarization, people polarizing themselves in terms of either good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, right, wrong. Like there's a whole lesson we don't have time to get into today, perhaps in a future video, about why I don't trust good people. That when people come up and tell me that they are good people, and when people tell themselves that they are good people, on the one hand, they may be right, that in many ways, they may be beneficent and kind and patient and fair and all of these noble characteristics. At the same time, though, by categorizing themselves as good, that also gives them carte blanche, gives them license to ill, right? A license to do whatever because they believe themselves to be good people. So therefore, whatever they're doing, no matter how harmful, is coming from a good place. Like when I go back through and think of the interpersonal, professional, psychological trauma that I've gotten in my life, and it's been quite a list, it's interesting how frequently good people are implicated in harming me intentionally and from a place of clean conscience. And so likewise, if you go back through time and place in your head and think of the times you've been mistreated, how many of those people believe themselves to be good people? So the other thing that this second dimension of categorization can lead to is what's called self-oriented perfectionism. This notion that there is this category for being that is superior, like obeying all the rules, obeying all the commandments, being perfectly ethical or perfectly legal or perfectly intelligent or perfectly grandiose, whatever, have a bajillion likes on Facebook or, a bajillion love hearts on Instagram. That there's this self-oriented perfectionism where somebody should, must, ought, have to be a certain way. And from that comes a lot of shame. That if one is not living up to this internal moral standard, then it's this either or, they're either good or bad. And one of the things I've found in conversing with people who suffer from this self-oriented perfectionism is that when you try to help them break out of it and look at their situations more third or fourth dimensionally, more constructed or contextually, it actually can upset them because they would and can sometimes argue that to not judge themselves is to allow for immorality or sin, that they have to hold to this extremely unrealistically high standards and to live in a state of shame, because to allow themselves some grace or some license to be imperfect or merely human is to enable sin or to enable weakness or things like that. So what in the world would be the advantage of a second dimensional approach to the self? So glad you asked. So The first dimension gives us certainty, right? I fit that particular category or not. But now we also have that first dimension in hierarchy, that not only am I certain that I meet this criteria, but now it's better than other criteria. So the advantage of this is I know exactly where I stand in, say, the moral economy of God, that I'm obeying commandments such that I know that I'm a good person because of all the rules that I obey, or I'm the best employee because look at all the rules that I obey. And therefore I'm better than other people who sin or other people who break the rules. That not only do I have a category for myself, but now it's a hierarchical category by which I can feel secure in relation to others, or if I really feel bad about myself, very insecure in relation to others. So the disadvantage is the same thing. By hierarchizing yourself, you really can't win. That it's always a power play, that there's always this, you're either better or worse than, and there's that constant comparison game. And I'm sure you all won't be surprised to hear that seems to correlate pretty strongly with depression and anxiety and relationship disruption. That even though it gives us a sense of certainty, it gives us a sense of certainty in relation to ourselves and to others. So, polarizing other people, that's another characteristic of the second dimension of thinking, that others are good, bad, right or wrong, healthy, unhealthy. And this creates other-oriented perfectionism. Other-oriented perfectionism is where you should, you must, ought, you have to, right? That you are holding these categories and standards, this better or worse standard, on other people. And that can lead to a lot of shaming of others. Oh my goodness gracious. So I was privy to a conversation between some school teachers because there is a style in one of the local or several of the local high schools, I didn't catch which, where young ladies will wear like an open sweater with just a brassiere underneath an open sweater. And these teachers were upset because of the immodesty of these girls. And therefore, the girls who dressed in a way where their shoulders were covered and their entire torso was covered was presumed to be a good, whereas girls who show a little bit of more skin in their sense of what is cute or their sense of style was bad. And that there are certain teachers in this conversation who would take these young ladies down to the principal's office to force them to put on a shirt. Because if they didn't, then that would enable the weakness of character of these girls or the weakness of the character of the boys involved. That everything was on this moral hierarchy, and so they had to control the girls' behavior as to not enable misdeeds or sin or unhealthy behavior for those girls or the boys or other girls that they relate to, right? It was very interesting hearing that conversation, that they were categorizing these girls as immoral, and therefore they had to intervene, and they had to intervene very directly. Some of these teachers did. Okay. So, again, why are we discussing authenticity? There are those who believe they speak authentically. Unfortunately, sometimes they harm or silence others by doing so. And when you come back to them and you say, hey, what you're saying is destructive, they will argue, no, I'm just being authentic. And in some ways they are, if we take up a first or second dimensional understanding of authenticity. You notice that both the first and second dimension are disengaged, ontologically disengaged, right? There's me and there's you, and we're totally separate from one another. I'm categorizing myself as an object, or I'm categorizing others as an object, right? So this disengaged ontology. So if they take up authenticity in that way, then they are being inauthentic, even if what they're doing is disrupting relationship, fracturing context, controlling other people. Then there's also the issue of those who do not speak are harmed by their not speaking. They may be afraid of being harmed if they do speak. And they can be sitting there in their insecure silence, believing themselves and guilting themselves that they are being inauthentic. Well, I should have said something, I should have spoken up, right? And maybe in some ways they are being inauthentic again, but only if we take this up first and second dimensionally and from a disengaged ontology. So let's kind of move from these disengaged ontologies of me and you to more engaged ontologies, like a third dimension, which is us. And then we'll get into a fourth dimension here in a moment, which is the context of I and thou. But for now, the us. This is the third dimension. This is within which all things are just socially constructed, ultimately relative. So, from within the third dimension, we relativize ourselves, that any category of self is relative and arbitrary, that who I am in the moment is constructed by myself and other people, and yet I don't always have access to other people's social constructions, and so therefore I construct myself. And so, what I see a lot is this kind of radical relativism amongst those who assume like a third dimensional authenticity, and that is they are whatever they are feeling in the moment. And it's very relative. In different moments, they can feel different things, but then their authenticity is constantly shifting in a way that can be a little puzzling, if not confusing, for the people around them. So, the advantage of this is that there's this radical freedom, this radical autonomy. I am whatever and whoever I am in the given moment. The disadvantage is this kind of groundlessness and meaninglessness, this kind of existential anomie with oneself, if you will. That, in looking across various times and various situations, I'm thinking of a person I know who is at a rave, very chemically fueled, various drugs, having a great time, having a party, and then is in church 2 days later, right? And stayed and stoic and quiet and reverent, and that particular religion kind of frowns upon or very much frowns upon the raving activity. And when I asked them about it, they were, well, when I'm at church, I'm at church, and I'm very churchy when I'm at church. When I'm out partying with my friends, I'm out partying with my friends because I'm having fun in one situation and having this meaningful spiritual experience in another situation, right? And okay, that worked great. But then later, the same person came and was upset and explaining they're upset to me, where they can't have an event with their church friends and their rave friends at the same event. And they're like, man, all my friends are so closed-minded. Yes, from a third dimensional frame, that is the case. The friends are closed-minded. The church friends don't mix well with the rave friends, and the rave friends don't mix well with the church friends. Adding to that stress, though, is the person's like, my rave friends want me to be more like them all the time, and my church friends want me to be like them all the time. Well, I'm raving when I'm raving, and I'm churching when I'm churching, and those are two different states of being for me, right? It's that kind of radical relativeness where other people then have a hard time kind of predicting, well, how are you going to be? Like, if I show up at your church and I've got the long green hair and the neon clothes, et cetera, coming from a rave, will you at that church welcome me with open arms? Or are you in church mode and will turn a blind eye to me the way other church people will, right? Creates this disconnect in interpersonal relationships. So likewise, we see people expressing authenticity in third dimension. They relativize the other, right? They relativize others, that any category of the other is relative and arbitrary, that they are their feelings. And so whatever feeling the other is having, that's their authentic self. And they get to have that authentic self. So there's nothing static in this particular way of understanding the self unless we are constructing it so in the moment. And this provides a lot of freedom and flexibility. So people are their feelings, and their identity is their feelings right here, right now, and it will constantly change, and that's all okay. And so there's this sense of radical acceptance, right? One of the strong advantages of third dimensional approaches to authenticity. Again, the disadvantage, though, is groundless and meaninglessness. Where do the bounds between self and other, how do we navigate that, especially when there's issues of politics or harm or other things involved? Like if I'm in the mood to get wasted and I'm high on hallucinogens and running through a park screaming, and that's my authentic self, well, the police also then get to be their authentic self, tackling to me, tasing me, tackling me to the ground, and hog tying me and throwing me in the back of their car, right? That how do we navigate how we should relate to each other if everything is relative? It's like we were at a parade a few years ago, and a big pride celebration parade. And there was a lot of beautiful and lovely things that happened. And a gentleman came over and was handing around these very professionally done little square cards. And it was an argument for a particular legislation that would allow adult men to have sexual relations with what are now adjudicated as underage children, people between the ages like 10 and 16. And so where do we navigate that space? Where do we say in a third dimension, hey, that's not okay? Like, right? We're left with just this radical relativism with no response to it, except our own personal feelings. But then if I assert my personal feelings, excuse me, sir, I don't believe this is appropriate, especially not in a place where we're celebrating all the dimensions of love. This dimension of love is often abusive, right? Especially coming at it clinically. Then how do we navigate that space if everything's just relative? Then it's my relative position. And so when I asked him, because I stood up and I was respectful, don't worry, but I said, sir, help me understand where this is coming from and how this is appropriate. And he argued that in his relative experience and those who share that particular interest with him, that this is what they are going to do. And that's relative and true to them, and they would like freedom and legislation to allow them to do it. And my response was, I would prefer you not. And he goes, oh, that's just you, right? And from a third dimensional frame, his argument makes sense. But there are other dimensions that I think for many of us come up in these situations, like the second dimension. And here in a minute, we'll get to the fourth dimension. So again, advantage, third dimensional folks radically accepting, or those who are thinking in third dimensional ways about a particular issue, radically accepting. Disadvantage, though, is where do we come to an understanding of what's okay and what's not as somebody is trying to authentically express themselves. So that brings us to the fourth dimension. So that's contextualizing the self and other in context. I am thou, and in relationship to thou art thou at the same time. And that's one of the things that's really tough when people are trying to wrap their heads around fourth dimensional thinking. And that is that we are all co-beings of being, and we're in relation to one another all at once. And therefore, whatever I'm saying or doing is already intentionally or unintentionally implicating you in that expression. Likewise, as you are expressing your thinking and feeling and behaving, that is always already implicating me, because I am now involved in that particular expression. So, because we are co-beings of being, my personality characteristics inform yours, and yours inform mine simultaneously. Like, I have people in my life that are even more outgoing and louder than I am. And so if you were to see me in a context with some of these people, some of them are family, that you would experience me as very quiet in relation to them, right? I'm not intentionally silencing myself necessarily. It's just that their personality is filling up the room to the point where there's not a lot of room for some of the rest of us. And so we find ourselves sitting quietly because there's very little space to be. And believe it or not, oftentimes that's fine. Now, again, negotiating for space, when somebody's talking about an idea, they're doing so very loudly and filling the room, and we also know about the thing, then we can negotiate and say, hey, I actually know something about that, or there's a question I'd like to ask, or a perspective I'd like to share about that, right? And so one of the things we find is that my personality and yours are co-informing one another's in real time quite often. For example, I've got teaching 100 students, like in a general psychology class, and I'll cover the concepts of introversion and extroversion. And I will ask them, and I will say, how many of you identify as extroverts? And a few hands go up, right? About a third. And then I'll say, how many of you identify as an introvert? And half to 2/3 of the hands will go up. And then I would say, okay, well, let me tell you a story. So imagine you're in an awkward situation, and it's really draining for you to be in that situation. Like, you're invited to a dinner party, and while you're at the dinner party, there are people there who you don't understand. You really don't feel like you fit in. I asked the extrovert, how many of you would find that draining? And almost all of them did. And I asked the introverts, imagine you're around your best friends, right? People who get you to the bones. They just love you to death. How many of you might act a little more loudly and, tell more jokes, be the center of attention? And a lot of the introverts raised their hand. And I said, okay, I thought you extroverts were always extroverts. I thought you introverts are always introverts. Or does it depend? You're an extrovert much of the time in contexts where your extroversion fits. The introverts are introverts much of the time when their introversion fits in those contexts. However, there are contexts within which an introvert may be feeling like an extrovert, and an extrovert may be feeling like an introvert because the context change, right? And so the students agree. They're like, oh my gosh, yeah, in certain contexts I am more extroverted, in other contexts I'm more introverted. That there are tendencies that across context I might tend to be a little more extroverted, a little more introverted, and yet I still can be very extroverted, says the introvert, and the extrovert can say, yeah, I can be pretty introverted. So this here and now context within which we dwell, this co-being of being, is already informed by our history, not only just the history between you and I personally, but our shared social history and our different social histories, right? The histories of our societies, the histories of our cultures, similarly and differently. Our intentions, my intent in yours. Our cultures are simultaneously lively. Our language, our family, our morals, our religion, our politics, our economics, all of this is lively, even if we share and differ on certain issues relative to these particular cultural phenomena. And so the advantage of this is connection, right? This willingness to really get with, relate to, and click together with other people. That we share a context, that in a radical sense, we share being. And with that comes true connection. There's not just, I'm apologizing for existing, like I've seen some people do. And I'm also not asserting my point of view and saying, this is who I am and you just have to deal with it. Instead, it's who are we together? And so with that comes moral commitment. That because we are co-beings of being, because we share being, therefore we are all engaged in it together. And that implies that there are times when I want to speak loudly, that this context calls for me to speak a little bit more softly. And there are times when I want to speak softly, but the context calls for me to speak a little loudly. Now, with that, I'm sure you're getting the disadvantage is vulnerability and uncertainty. That if we're really truly getting to know one another, then we can be truly harmed. When I'm just an object to you, you can't really hurt my soul. And when you're just an object to me, I really can't hurt your soul. You know, sticks and stones may break your bones, and names will never hurt you if the person calling you names doesn't matter to you. But when they do, sticks and stones hurt a lot less than a name called or a word spoken when it cuts us to our soul. So that kind of vulnerability and uncertainty is one of the reasons why it's hard for us to remain in a fourth dimensional space with one another. Likewise, to my conversation at this Pride Parade with this man hanging out flyers to pass legislation to make certain activities legal. That the culture is, and the reality is, people of certain ages cannot fully consent because they do not understand all of the ramification of what consent means. So therefore, it would be aberrant to pass legislation that allows them to express consent that they do not understand with those who are older than them who do understand consent. So therefore, sir, I have to oppose you on this, right? This isn't okay. This isn't consenting behavior amongst adults. That I appreciate this is your tendency, your proclivity, your orientation, and I accept that. At the same time, though, I must simultaneously say, no, that I'm not going to support you in this because it's not okay. So let's review authenticity in dimensional terms. In the first dimension, what is authentic is an expression of my categorical identity. Hey, I just got to be me. This is what various scholars like Bella et al. In a book called Habits of the Heart called expressive individualism. One of the things I once heard a friend say is, I'm just more than other people can handle. And then she went on to say, and if they can't handle me at my worst, they don't deserve me at my best. And I kind of chuckled about that because it's a very first and second dimensional way for her to express herself. To behave otherwise than my personal category, goes the argument, creates discomfort, shame, guilt, and anxiety in me. And because others are an extension of my ego, I must express myself to them and at them in a way that requires them to conform to me just got to be me, right? So if I got to be me, you have to adjust because I'm being authentic, right? That's first dimensional way of thinking about authenticity. With the second dimension, what is authentic is the expression of my categorical identity in a hierarchy. My characteristics are better than yours. You're either with me or against me. This can be intellectually, religiously, politically, morally, economically. If you have a problem with me, then it's a problem with you, right? This way in which I believe I'm right because I'm speaking from a place of certainty and confidence, having checked with my own feelings on the matter, and therefore because I'm clear on what my feelings are in the matter and I can express them. Now, if you disagree, we are opposed to one another, and I must put us on a hierarchy of who is right and wrong and who's better or worse. Okay? So I see this with religious reasoning a lot. You're not with the gospel, and I am with the gospel, or you're not following commandments, and I am following commandments. I see this politically. You're liberal, you're conservative, Democrat, Republican, in a way where they then try to establish this hierarchy of rightness over one another. Like, it reminds me of a phenomenon I see from time to time called the narcissistic apology. A narcissistic apology looks like this. Somebody will express themselves. Oh my gosh, I saw this the other day. It drove me up a wall. I was in a department store looking for socks, and I heard a father tell his son, well, if you weren't so fat, it would be easier to find your clothes. And I'm looking at the kid, and he was a little chubby, but he wasn't fat. And the little boy got upset and said, Dad, that was really mean. And Dad just kind of patted him on the head and said, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. Not, I'm sorry for hurting your feelings, right? So this is what's called a narcissistic apology. It's not really an apology. And so, again, others in a second dimensional frame, like in the first, are just an extension of my ego, where I have this category of understanding, right? And I put it out into the world, and other people have to adjust to it. Okay, with the third dimension, what is authentic is my feeling in the moment with others. I am who I am relative to who I'm around. And likewise, who we are is relative to who we are around. So any personal or relational identity we have is strongly socially constructed in the moment with other people. So relational institutions around family, gender, community, work are all just socially constructed and relative. And they're relative based on mine and yours feelings and independent of one another. So ultimately, others are an extension of the arbitrary cultural meanings of society. And within that, they're adjusting and having feelings and changing. And this provides a lot of anti-bias and radical acceptance of others. However, this can also provide placelessness and a question of where boundaries should, must, ought, legally, and morally be. Whereas the fourth dimension, what is authentic is our mutual encounter with one another in the face-to-face and the here and now, as co-beings of being in a relational process. In this particular understanding, authenticity is relational, it is approximate, it is participated in by all the parties implicated in that to varying degrees. Authenticity is contextualized by our shared understanding and our background context of culture, language, history, religion, politics, economics, etc., each of which is navigable in the process, and each of which can be discussed. Yesterday, for example, a friend of mine and her husband stopped by, and she was once a proselyting member of a religion where she served a volunteer mission for some period of time. I think it was 18 months or so, where she went on her own cost and on her own time to proselyte that particular religion. And since returning, she has taken up that religion in a different way, to the point where she has largely left it behind. One of her dear friends from that time is still a devout member of that faith and will bring up faith-based topics because that's where they used to connect. And she is considering ending that particular friendship because of this dynamic of him bringing up these things. And so when I asked her about that, because she was just mentioning to her husband that, and they were kind of talking about it, looking at me like they were interested in my point of view on it. My point of view on it was, is it open for dialogue? Not dismissal, not dissolution, not deconstruction, but can we come to understand it together? Because there are the values that we have that are often understood in this relationship, in this context with I and thou. And sometimes those values get shifted into the category of ideology, where they are no longer discourseable, where we can no longer discuss them. They are forced into that particular context as givens. And that's just the way it is. And I'm not going to budge on this particular point. And when that happens, then sometimes the relationship, the context, doesn't work as well. Like, remember as a child when you were playing in a sandbox and you'd come across a big rock, that the rest of the sand you could build something with other people around, but when they would put a rock down, then sometimes you couldn't build with that, right? And so I asked this friend of mine, I said, okay, so has he confused his values for ideologies? Because ideologies are often second dimensional. They're often dogmatic and hierarchical. if there are ways in which he's willing to share what he believes respectfully, because this is what he very importantly values. And if you are able to take that up and say, hey, here's how I agree and disagree with what you're saying, then the relationship remains authentic. But if his position is, here is my point of view, and you must have to agree with me, and you must have agree with me in the way I wish to be agreed with, and I will not budge from this point, then values have shifted into an ideology. And then the other person may say, well, that is not authentic to the context of our relationship, and therefore the relationship is being dissolved around that point of inauthenticity, right? So sometimes our ideological stands are important. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes we do have to stand up and say no. And I've shared an example of that, walking with a gentleman who had handed me a flyer that really troubled me, where I'm like, no, this isn't okay, and I'm not voting for this. I will vote against this, right? And there are times, likewise, when our responses are a little more strident and a little more firm. And that's when our ideologies are understood within a context to transcend the values that we share or the value I have for you. That I may still respect somebody and their being, and I may still seek to care for their being, but at the same time, though, I will not budge on a given stance. That's when it's ideology. And therefore, there are some relationships that are incompatible with ideologies. Perhaps in another video, another day. A question that comes up regularly in some of my classes is, when does a peace-loving person draw their sword? Because peace-loving people are usually a little wary of ideologies and usually focus on values, particularly the value of relationship and the value of the other. Sometimes, though, we need to take a stand. There's this discourse that I heard a comedian talking about the other day, and that is nice versus kind. Nice is when people are just gentle and sweet to your face. Kind is when they do what is right for you in this given context, right here, right now. Whether or not they do it nicely is a different issue. And so one of the things about kindness is, I appreciate it as a system of values in and of itself, where you tend to look out for the welfare of others around you. And sometimes, most often, that's quite nice. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you will look out for others in a way that is not nice, even if ultimately it is kind. So that kind of nice versus kind requires a fourth dimensional understanding of when do we take a stand and confront a friend? When do we say, no, I'm not going to help you with that, or I'm going to actively oppose you? That all of that arises in contextual understanding, just as much as I'm going to stand with you. I'm going to fight alongside you. I will not only be your ally and speak my voice, I will be an advocate with you and I will show up. That's also fourth dimensional. So, thank you for joining me today on the issues of authenticity and the four dimensions, right? These dimensional ways. So as you can tell, my bias is that I think the most authentic authenticity is fourth dimensional. However, as a fourth dimensional thinker, and many of you listening to these videos because you're interested, will note that there are time and places for the first, second, and third, that they make sense in certain contexts. Overall, though, we return to what is authentic to this context. And what is authentic to this context is the reality of other people, their inherent worth. That even when we disagree, we can disagree in a way authentic to the context of our disagreement, and not escalate it or deny it or minimize it. So thank you for joining me today on another episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. I'll see you in the next video.